He's Justin Moretto.
And he's Thomas Torre.
And this is a podcast.
And you are a podcast listener.
And if you like 90s action movies,
have we got an episode for you.
Cue the drums.
I'm a filmmaker.
I'm a scientist.
And we're two friends who've made movies together.
And launched a company together.
And we lost our money.
And our identity.
But we are finding ourselves again.
And this is our podcast.
This is it.
Welcome.
Welcome to episode 9, everybody.
In today's episode, we talk about story structure and a few popular models for breaking down your narrative.
3 acts, 5 acts, 12 acts, saving cats, inciting incidents. Does any of it even matter?
It matters to John McClane.
Ooh, and Richard Kimball.
And John Woo.
John Woo. Speaking of John Woo, we do a little career highlight of the legendary Chinese action director.
Cue the doves.
All that and more on this episode of our podcast. And also, when this airs, the Oscars were last night. Should we talk about, who won? Congratulations to that winner.
Big upset.
Oh, yeah, the big upset in that tie, in that speech. How about that speech?
Oh, but what about the thing that they, with the envelope?
Oh, the envelope thing, yeah. Oh, and the quarantine fiasco.
Oh, right, because of the Zoom.
Anyway, good Oscars last night.
And congratulations again to Justin Moretto for winning. For really sweeping the Oscars.
You did sweep. I saw you with a broom with the janitorial staff.
Hey, I got an award for it.
So today I will hear if All the Names We Buried is the recipient of a grant that we applied for.
Yeah.
We applied for the Ford Producers Grant at the Sun Valley Film Festival. And we were notified we were a top 3 finalist. So the Sun Valley Film Festival will have just finished by the time this airs. And you will be able to see All the Names We Buried as one of 3 finalists for the Ford Producers Grant. Very exciting to be a finalist. And of those 3, one will be chosen for the grant. And it would be a nice little chunk of money to add to our budget as we continue to raise. On episode 7, I think I talked about pivoting the production down to a smaller size, aiming for September of 2021 to shoot. And our producer, Noah, said, hey, you should apply to this grant. I did, and we are a finalist.
Noah, what a great guy.
So by the time we record the scripted bits for this episode, we should know if we won the grant. So I will
is there a chance that we might hear while we're recording? Like that you could, interrupting this broadcast? Breaking news?
There would be. They're in mountain time. So because of the time of day.
Oh, so they're doing a little bit of this.
I don't know. I don't know if we will hear. They told me Friday, but then I saw on their website the winner announced Sunday. So I don't know if they're going to tell ahead of time and then announce to the public Sunday, or maybe I won't find out till Sunday. There is a chance that it would be in a couple days I'd find out. Anyway, other good news with All the Names We Buried as we continue to try to raise money and get that project into production shall be coming. Can I briefly tell you the highlight of my week? Perhaps one of the great highlights of my career thus far.
Please tell me.
You know about this.
I don't. I have no idea.
But our listeners don't. I got to meet John Woo. Now, granted, it was Zoom because nobody's meeting in person, even though he lives in LA. But the legendary Hong Kong action director John Woo and I had a good 45-minute Zoom. He's attached to direct a project which has not been announced yet, so I won't say anything here, and I am in consideration for the screenwriting job. And man, it was a thrill. My agent represents him and said, hey, Thomas, I think you'd be good for this project he's attached to. And it's a true story, so I was able to research it a little bit, and I said I would love to do that. Of course, even if I wouldn't have loved it, I would have been like, yes, I want to write John Woo's movie. But I happened to really love the subject matter, and I really felt I could lend a voice to it. So that was months ago, and we were waiting on his notes, and finally they came in, and I was able to pitch my take on the material. And I put together a pretty thoughtful, thorough, graphical PDF deck, which is definitely over and above what they were expecting. So there's sort of a risk of doing too much, but I took a risk, and I made this presentation. And they were really blown away. So we had a conversation, and I still, it's no longer a long shot that I'll get the job because I feel like there's only a handful that he's going to interview, but I do still feel in my heart that statistically I'm more likely not to get it, because I'm assuming they're talking to several writers, many of whom are more experienced. I mean, at this point, I have 3 produced scripts and a couple others that are in earlier various stages, but I'm still very young, unknown, and I got to imagine a lot more experienced writers with credits much more similar to the type of movie he wants to make are vying for the job. So
some people, they might not know who John Woo is if they're younger, or if they're not like a follower. So John Woo, he really revolutionized the action. Huge. I'm fairly certain he started in sort of the Hong Kong film market, right? I mean, that's where I first came across him. First film I ever saw of his was The Killers, Chow Yun-fat.
Yep.
Great. I mean, gritty.
In late 80s.
Yeah, there's like 89 or 92 or something like that.
And you're absolutely right, because I like some of my brothers-in-law who are several years younger than me, I said, did you grow up on John Woo movies of the 90s? So I have to ask people, because
and they probably, I mean, they would know like Face Off probably, or like Mission Impossible. He did one of those, but they might, if you're not a cinephile, then you don't always register who directed something.
Right. So John Woo, as you said, started in Hong Kong action films. When you see guys jumping across cars in slow motion, shooting their Berettas as they're sort of sideways in the air, I mean, that was John Woo. I don't know if he invented it, but he certainly pioneered the slow motion gun action Hong Kong crime genre that was often repeated, never equaled.
I have to imagine that there's some sort of there are things that he revolutionized in sort of in the way that the Wachowskis, what their sort of introduction of bullet time. Certainly somebody may have done it, but like they're the ones that made it. There's got to be something with some mechanical shooting or something, because there's just a style to his early films. I mean, even the sort of the martial arts based films had that sort of feel to them. That I think he really came to it in the mafia type films, crime family, I guess.
I watched a little documentary on him just in preparation of the call, and it was really interesting how he got his start. Back then, Chinese film was big on comedies, silly slapstick comedies, late 70s, early 80s, and so he was making those just to get experience, didn't really want to be making those. Really, he's always wanted to make, dramas and romantic films, larger films, not even necessarily action films. But he was given an opportunity to make his first action movie, which was A Better Tomorrow, which was a big hit. And he really, his innovation was taking the lyrical action choreography of the samurai movies, but instead of, period samurais with swords, he updated it to present day, crime and guns, and took that same lyricism of choreographed action violence and really applied it to the gangster genre of Chinese and Hong Kong cinema, and really infused his action with heart and drama. He always talks about, I never separated drama and action. It was always one and the same. So his action had just a real dramatic heft to it. And of course, he filmed it very lyrically, very poetically with these slow motion sort of choreography. And A Better Tomorrow was a huge hit. The Killers came out. That was a huge international hit. Mm-hmm. And then Hard Boiled. And then he had a run in the 90s of coming to Hollywood and he made Hard Target, which was like legitimately my favorite action movie as a kid. I mean, I watched that movie all the time. Van Damme. Yeah. Broken Arrow, Mission Impossible 2, Face Off, which is probably his best English language film. Yeah, in my opinion.
So every time Thomas has mentioned this John Woo project, I've always, reminded him not to forget the Doves, and he was always like, "What are you talking about? How is it that you love Face Off that much and you don't know about the John Woo Doves?"
Well, I do now, and in retrospect, it's there's doves in all of his films, but I just didn't remember it.
I know. We're going to have to re-record the opening to this, where it says, "Hi, my name is Justin Moretto, and I'm a filmmaker, and I'm Thomas, and I'm the scientist, I guess.
And I'm a dude." No, well, it's true.
That scene in Face Off where it's like the billowing, like, curtains, and he like walks in and there's like doves. Like, where the hell do these doves come from? But you know what? It doesn't matter. I think John Woo films fit in to me, and this is an episode that we've talked about that I really want to do, which is sort of like loving quote bad films, like loving films that get panned, because I think sometimes films get panned because they're watching it for sort of an Oscar contender, and it's like, no, this is just meant to entertain, don't pan it. It's just entertain. And I feel like Paycheck was one of those movies. I don't like Ben Affleck. I feel like I've only ever really liked him in Gone Girl. Other than that, he's more successful than me, obviously, but he's just not my cup of tea. But I feel like that movie was actually very entertaining. And maybe it's because it was based on a Philip K. Dick book, who I love. But I thought he did a really good job with that. And it just got utterly obliterated by critics.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I actually liked Paycheck too. And that was his last English language film. He went back to China. One of his most well-received film was late 2000s, maybe mid-2000s, Red Cliff, this 2-part epic Chinese period film that I haven't seen, but I just ordered the Blu-ray, so I'm excited to watch it. And then he still worked. He did, at the time, maybe about 10 years ago, I think the most expensive film in China that was ever made. It was basically this period, their version of Titanic. It was the same type of film, or 1940s China, an ocean liner. There's a sinking ship, and it was just massive and epic. 2 parts, so it was it came out part 1 and part 2, 2 hours each. Very poorly received, very panned. I didn't see it. I actually tried. It's called The Crossing. You can't really find it here. I'd be really interested to see that film because the one in question that I'm being interviewed to write is a period drama that is set in America, which would primarily be an English language film, and which is why they're talking to an American writer. So I'm interested to see The Crossing. And then his last film was 2017's Manhunt, which is a throwback to his early 1980s, Hong Kong action movies. It's just a fun, pulpy, bloody action movie. And, he's still he's attached to the Monkey King. It's a superhero film with a Chinese superhero, a character Stan Lee created. He's attached as a producer with an eye to direct, and he's trying to get this project off the ground, which is very much a passion project. So, like Clint Eastwood, Ridley Scott, these directors in their 70s and 80s, they're just still cranking. It's just inspiring because I've always said, I'm never going to retire, And Tarantino, by contrast, he's like, no, I'm going to retire after 10 movies because film's a young man's game. And I'm thinking, well, to a degree, but then you've got men like Hitchcock, who was directing amazing work to the end. Clint Eastwood is still a badass, making great films.
I mean,
I
think Clint Eastwood
is still incredible.
Clint Eastwood is like on the rise, if anything.
I don't know if you can really top Unforgiven, which is the penultimate masterpiece. And but no, he's still fresh and awesome. And yeah, anyway, we'll see. I'll keep everyone updated if I land this John Woo gig.
Medicine for business or pleasure?
Both. Look at it this way. You're gonna get to meet Elvis. Give it a rest, pal.
Jean-Claude Van Damme is the hard target.
You miss me?
From internationally acclaimed action director John Woo.
How's it feel to be hunted?
You tell me. Hard Target.
Coming up, Justin talks about some dude's pyramid scheme and how it applies to story structure.
At least I don't get all pretentious and invoke Aristotle's Poetics.
Stay with us.
He's obviously not someone we should underestimate.
So if this doesn't have legs, we can scrap it and go to something else.
Okay.
But I thought for today we would do something where I kind of spring something on Thomas. Give him a little quiz, a little pop quiz.
Hot Shot.
And
name that movie.
Yeah, name that movie. No, that would be terrible because.
No. Pop quiz, Hot Shot. What's that from?
Oh, I don't know.
You're on a bus.
Oh, yeah.
You
Speed.
hit 50 miles an. Anyway.
So we're not going to be talking about speed today because I wanted to talk about something that you and I have talked about quite a bit before, and we even, I think, teased it before, and that's about the story structure and the different kind of story structures there are. There's the classic 3-act, right? You have talked about the Shakespearean 5-act version. I have talked about Freytag's pyramid as ways to construct a narrative. And then obviously then there's the discussion about whether you start with that or you essentially build out your story and then fill in as needed to make it fit to that. So we can talk about that. But my thought was we would pick something that we know really well, and we would actually try to go through and diagram and see how it fits into these things. And something like Speed might, I don't remember it well enough to really like get into those beats.
I mean, action movies are definitely adhere to a very traditional structure. It could be fun to look at a few. For me, structure is definitely something that the different structural models are largely tools that can be applied to most stories. I mean, the ones that break structure are the exceptions that prove the rule, but they're also largely something that we can sort of retroactively apply. And I kind of intuitively think about structure when I'm writing, but it's not something I overtly think about. It's something that kind of in retrospect I can sort of apply. Okay, here are the act beats if in a 3-act structure. Here are sort of the act beats in a 5-act structure. There's 12-act or 10-act. I mean, there's a lot of different models to look at story, and they're all useful.
I'm not suggesting that maybe for some people this is the way that they work, but that you start with like a piece of paper with 3-act structure written on it, and then you fill it in, and that's how you build your story. More like for me, it was guideposts. Like, have I established this? Mm-hmm. Did I give enough time to this component, right? And as like writing the story and then sort of glancing over from time to time to like look at what I've done and see, is it falling into place, just to look for gaps. So not in any way that it's meant to be a map to get you there. Mm-hmm. And so, I have the reason that I mentioned Freytag's pyramid is because it's just something that I found very useful for me. And I am curious to sort of go through it with you.
Remind us what that is.
Yeah, let me throw up an image of it so you can look at it while I'm describing it.
We'll link to Freytag's pyramid in our notes.
Okay, so here's what we got. It is a in the simple version of it, it is a pyramid that has 2 flat legs. Like a flat side on the left, and then it goes up in a triangle, down the other side of the triangle, and then flat to the right. In its sort of original form, it consists of 7 elements: exposition, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, and the denouement. And so this one puts like the base of exposition, kind of that leg at the same height as the resolution and denouement. A lot of them I've seen it where they essentially, and not that it matters, but they shorten the leg between the climax and the resolution, assuming that in reality that is going to be a much shorter time period. And so, if we talk about what each of these things are, the exposition, that's the scene setting. You're meeting the characters. You're understanding what world you're existing in, right? Then there's the inciting incident, which is pretty self-explanatory. The character is reacting to something, and their reaction initiates a chain of events. The rising action, which is the first upslope in the pyramid, that would be the story building. Either there is an attempt at resolution, and then the underlying problem gets more complex, or maybe it's revealed to be more complex than first thought. I think I see that a lot, where it's like, oh, it's a piece of cake, and then obviously it's like, oh, this is way bigger than, kind of a trope. So then there's the climax. Again, this is the point of the greatest tension between the protagonist, antagonist. And this is where I think the pyramid sort of kind of glosses over like a whole thing. This is one of the weak points in my opinion. After that, you have the falling action, which is like the reversal, I guess, the results of the climax, which then lead to the resolution. And then, the denouement, the ending, which is like just kind of the very final moments.
Yeah, this is interesting. I I don't know that I've seen this before. I mean, I don't know that if this isn't, like you mentioned, this isn't necessarily intended to be sort of scale with the climax, because the climax is right in the middle of this pyramid,
right?
Which would imply in the middle of the story, which is definitely
no. I mean,
not
that's
how
probably
climaxes function.
85%, 90% of the way, or like maybe the climax starts 85% of the way in, and it ends maybe like 95% of the way. Mm-hmm. So you've got that 5%, 5 to 10% to wrap up falling action resolution in the denouement. I think one of the things I see a lot in rising action is people making stupid decisions that like they could have avoided the entire film, which I know that's kind of misses the point, but of people making dumb choices, or like you see people not telling other people things, because they're afraid of what they'll say or think, which then makes the consequences so much worse. Those kind of things I often see falling into that rising action category, which to me is a very interesting portion of any story. So anyway, that is Freytag's pyramid. I think everybody knows 3-act. 5-act is a little bit less.
3-act, definitely. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. It's definitely helpful because I think the more macro you can get with story structure, it's easier. You can think of your story in much fewer parts, and then in some ways each different sort of structure model helps you break it down in another level. For the classic 3-act structure, your opening act is typically includes the pre-existing condition, which is the world building, like the world of the character, what world he lives in, but also what's very important to establish is the pre-existing condition. Like if a story is ultimately about a man dealing with his grief, or in Die Hard, a man trying to reunite with his estranged wife, that is his pre-existing condition. So it opens, he's flying in to LA, and he's sort of a fish out of water because he's a New York guy, and his wife took on her maiden name because she's, working in this corporate world, and they're not divorced, but they're estranged. They're living on opposite coasts. She's sort of pursuing a career. Their marriage is on the rocks. And he's reminded of this when he looks her up and he's like, oh man, she's using her maiden name. And he kind of confronts her, in the hotel room. And he's invited there for the annual holiday party for this big...
Her office.
For her office
in
Nakatomi Plaza. And so the pre-existing condition is a rocky marriage. And then you're also describing the world. Okay, corporate New York guy. He's in LA. He's not just sort of a fish out of water. He's a blue collar guy. He's a cop. So it's the world is all of those aspects which endear us to our character, but also sort of show how different he is from his setting. And then the inciting incident, you can kind of define it a couple ways. You might say the inciting incident is then the thing that kicks off our plot, which is not the same as changing from Act 1 and Act 2. In this case, it's Hans Gruber initiating a robbery of the place. He holds the place hostage. That's sort of the inciting incident. But I would say Act 1 doesn't go to Act 2 until John McClane gets involved with it. Because you can really think of Act 2 as what our story is about. If we say, it's about a cop trying to save the day in the face of these thieves in Nakatomi Plaza, that plot point is what sort of kicks off Act 2. So it's not until John McClane gets involved in it that we have, okay, here's what the film is about. And you can sort of watch a film, and usually around, anywhere between 20 and 45 minutes, you can kind of get a sense of like, here's what the film is about. I now have my characters, I have the setting, I have this inciting incident, which is a catalyst for the events. But then how the characters respond to that incident and what they feel like ultimately they have to do about it is then what the film is about, insofar as how we kind of repeat it to people. The film's about, a blue-collar cop in L.A. trying to save the day.
So for Die Hard, the Hans Gruber walks in, he does the thing, his whole team, they get in the elevator, and they kill the security guard, they ride up, and then he shoots the machine gun in the room during the holiday party, right? That is the inciting incident, right?
Yeah, or I think also known as catalyst. I mean, I would... That's another common word for what I would say is the same point in the story.
Okay. And so then maybe at that point, if I remember correctly, John McClane is in the shower or something. Because she in her office, right? She had like a little ensuite bathroom and all that. And if I remember, he hears the gunshots, but he's not around, right?
Right.
So you're saying there's the inciting incident, and then the Act 2 starts once we know
what our character's purpose is.
That's the whole reason he doesn't have shoes in the entire thing is because he was in his tank top, his pants, and he grabs his gun, no shoes. And then that's it for the film and in terms of his what he's wearing. But so the moment that you would say Act 2 begins is when I believe he knocks out one of the guys or something, when they come searching all the offices.
Yeah, the moment that both John McClane and by extension us the audience realize, oh, there's a problem and I have to now be the hero.
In this case, it's a short window between.
In this case, it's a short window, and there's usually most stories, once there's a catalyst, would quickly go into Act 2. And usually at Act 2, there's sort of another there's the inciting incident, but then there's sort of the hero's incident or another sort of semi-catalyst. I think of The Fugitive, which has a really long Act 1, where the world of the story is this doctor who's being accused of his wife's murder. We go through all of this, the trial, and you could say the inciting incident is the murder of his wife, and then he goes to jail. But Act 2 really begins once Dr. Kimball is setting off trying to find the man who killed his wife. That doesn't happen until after
post-train accident.
Post-train. So the train and then some people say, well, the train's then the inciting incident. And I would say, okay, well then, that whatever the event is that gets us into Act 2, but I would say, well, the inciting incident is
that almost seems like
the murder of his wife.
Yeah, that almost seems like maybe that would be, and this is very specific semantics, but the difference between maybe an inciting incident and a catalyst, because it feels like the murder of the wife is, and again, I'm not correcting you, I'm just kind of queuing off, is that the inciting incident would be the wife, and then the catalyst would be the train crash. Now, maybe sometimes they're one and the same.
Yeah.
But in this case, it feels like they're two different things.
And the subjective nature of it, I think, proves that structure models are really useful when you kind of hold them loosely. You just tell a good story, and in retrospect, you can kind of apply the model so you kind of get a sense of when things are happening. Because if you're trying to figure out of just man, it takes me forever for my Dr. Kimball to get on the mission to find the killer, then you realize. Then you can kind of have a sense of how to fix that because you have a sense of, okay, that's what my story's about. Or, man, it's taken forever for John McClane to enter this fight. If you really have a handle on story and you look back, you can be like, you know what? No, that's got to have to happen pretty quickly after my inciting incident because that's really where the film's going to live. And then within Act 2, which, if Act 1 is the first quarter and Act 3 is the last quarter, Act 2 would be 2 quarters. So Act 2 is always usually going to be your biggest area because you're covering a lot of ground. You have rising and falling actions within that. You have setups, you have payoffs, you have a midpoint. And when I'm thinking of structure, I'm ahead of time because I like to outline. I intuitively am like, okay, I know I need to spend time building the world and establishing the pre-existing condition. And then I always have a sense of what my midpoint is. And then, of course, your ending, what it's all leading up to, which is the climax, which is the height of what the action's leading up to. And then the resolution, denouement, sometimes can be super quick after it. Or I think when movies feel like they're going on, it's really when there's a lot packed in after the climax. A really useful thing that I use, and I just sort of piece this together from reading a lot of different books on story and structure, and it's less even labeling things in certain beats or acts or ascribing page counts, which is kind of arbitrary. Your Act 1 should be X pages, your whatever. Is thinking, okay, pre-existing condition deals with theme, and then you have an incident or a catalyst, which then creates the internal condition, which is, okay, if, John McClane his pre-existing condition is I got to reconcile with my wife. The plot then creates an internal condition, which is I've got to save the day. And that's plot. Plot is sort of what happens. And then by the end of Act 2, you can largely solve the internal condition. It's like, okay, I know what I have to do. And leading up to this climax, I've got to, kill Hans Gruber. Or, Richard Kimball discovering that not just who killed my wife, but that there was this greater controversy at play that he didn't even realize. And then your final act always goes back to the pre-existing condition. And by the end of your film, your character has then grown, usually for the better, from the pre-existing condition. Like John McClane reunites with his wife. I mean, that's what it's going on. That's all what it's going up to. And that always deals with theme. So if you establish a strong pre-existing condition that then gets paid off at the end by the events of the plot, you have a strong theme. So your plot is usually Act 2. Or in the 5-act structure, there's different 5-act structures. I've actually used one that Film Crit Hulk, which is a great blogger, talks about in one of his articles. And he invokes Shakespeare, and Shakespeare usually uses this 5-act structure, but you could also call it a 3-act structure. It's just a different way to divide it up, which is there's your opening, catalyst, midpoint, spiral, ending. I guess. I don't even remember. Like, I don't even think about the names of it. I just sort of, intuitively sort of think about the stories with your opening, the catalyst, the midpoint, the spiral, usually from the midpoint to the climax. There's this spiral where you things are getting out of control, you're losing ground, but you know what you have to do. And then after the climax, you are then able to reconcile the events of the pre-existing condition.
So in the 3-act, the climax is sort of the transition point from 2 to 3. Like as the climax wraps, that's when Act 3 would begin.
So I think in...
and again, I don't mean this to be prescriptive. I'm curious just about
right, and that's the trap.
Because one of the things I will say, I think this is one of those examples where it's like, it's good to know the rules so that you can work around them, right? Like really great piano players, they know all of the perfect technique and then they break it, and that's how they make beautiful music. So I don't mean this to be like this is how it should be done, but like what is the prescriptive nature, of these different structures? Just curiosity.
It would typically, and the trap of any of these structures is to make it prescriptive. And there's a lot of like film courses or books that would say, do it this way. You can spend a lot of money on things that are prescriptive that aren't going to make you a better writer. So it's good to just sort of hold these things loosely. But the way I remember sort of understanding it best, or the way I apply it in 3-act, is the 3rd act begins once the heroes knows what they have to do. It doesn't begin with the climax. The climax is usually the midpoint of the 3rd act.
I see.
Bruce Willis, John McClane, if the 2nd act begins once he enters the fray, and then the whole 2nd act is him trying to figure out, okay, what's going on? How do I defeat these guys? And then there's different layers of like, oh, these guys, we thought they were terrorists. They're actually just thieves.
Yeah,
because the codes.
I feel like that is one, if to sort of relate this back to the Freytag's pyramid, part of that rising action that I like is that, they very intentionally put themselves out there as terrorists. We're here and we want I can't remember who it is that they're trying
as
to
a smokescreen.
Yeah, all their demands are related to the freeing of political prisoners, right? And in the writing of it, not like it's Die Hard, so it's not like, cinematic, masterpiece. But the thing that was very...
Oh, but it is.
Okay. But, a lot of people would say that, whatever, it's not Criterion Collection or whatever. But that was...
But it is.
Is it in the Criterion Collection?
Yeah.
Okay. Look, I don't know anything.
It's considered a masterpice. I mean, but no, it's,
it's an action film.
Sure.
Right?
It's elevated B-movie.
It is, and it is very elevated. And because they were, the reason that they picked that, those characters was because they knew that it would take a lot of time. It would be almost impossible to actually get. And they didn't want it. What they wanted was time. They wanted the time because they knew that they needed a lot of time to break into that safe.
Right.
And that is that revelation to me was the like, oh shit, I'm dealing with very different.
Yeah.
These are not, bang, bang, smash them up terrorists who are just trying to get their brothers out of prison. This is a very highly trained, financially driven, heavily like backed, like when pulls out the rocket launcher. It's like, all right, these are not just dudes with AK-47s. These guys came, they're well funded and they're well prepared. And that is like that sort of secondary reveal that ups the stakes even more.
And the moment that John McClane, I think, or the audience realizes, oh, here's what they're after. And then he's like, okay, now here's how we're going to win the day. That then begins Act 3. And the climax isn't till, you got one of the greatest shots in action movie history of, Alan Rickman looking at the camera, falling slow motion, from the watch. I mean, that's the climax classically of the film, the point of highest interest when the hero actually outsmarts and kills the villain. But that's not the beginning of Act 3. The beginning of Act 3 is when he sets in motion the kind of the mini plot of how he's going to achieve that. And a great way, I think, there's 10 act or 12 act structures. There's different kind of new models that talk about film in sequences. And that can be a really helpful thing to think about. Is don't think about acts, but think about sequences. And if your opening sequence, because a scene is a scene, it's a single block that's really relative to a location. But a sequence could be a variety of scenes strung together that achieve a greater purpose. They all have their own little mini arc. And your opening sequence is always going to establish your world and your pre-existing condition, almost all the time. I mean, the films that don't, again, the exceptions that prove the rules. Then the next sequence, which could be one scene, could be 5 scenes, could be 5 minutes, could be 20 minutes. But the next sequence would be, okay, now what is our inciting incident that then puts our characters into our plot? And then the next sequence would be, bridging into Act 2, which is how do our characters then respond to that inciting incident and what is the journey they're going to go on? And then, the next sequence would be, how do we complicate that? How do we get them to, a low point, a point where all seems lost? And then, how do they then see the light at the end of the tunnel? The next sequence is sort of like, oh, here's something I hadn't realized. Here's a whole new.
I feel like maybe we should take that idea, which is really good. We should apply it to other mediums. Maybe for like books, we could call them like chapters or something.
Well, but even like what defines a chapter? Because sometimes it's not just a scene.
No, it is a string of scenes. And it is,
right.
As you're describing this, it sounds very much. I don't know. I'm not a very a technically trained writer, so I don't know if there is supposed to be something that is like very well defined. What makes a chapter? So I mean, you've read my work. I don't know necessarily when to start. And to me, it's like it's what you're describing. It is a sequence that is necessarily tied together, right? Whether it's in a small temporal period of time, or it is in sort of one thematic element that needs to be dealt with. And that's how I've always encapsulated things.
Yeah. Don't go anywhere. Our conversation on story structure continues.
And after that, Thomas reveals the outcome of the Sun Valley Film Festival producers.
They called me the night we recorded that conversation.
I can't wait.
I mean, classically, Save the Cat is a really famous book where he talks about structure, and I think he kind of employs a 10 or 12 sort of beat structure. And I read the book, and I wrote one outline kind of applying its model. I've largely found it unhelpful, although a friend of mine who writes a ton finds it really helpful. And when he makes his outline, he thinks about it in the Save the Cat sort of 12 sequence beat. I have taken the structure that I find I normally kind of think about is taking some elements of Save the Cat, applying it, to something a lot less formal, but also, less beats, and really thinking of it. I think about my film in 2 halves. I think about my films in 3 acts. I think about them in 5 acts. I think about them in multiple sequences. I don't always count them. And like I said, a lot of it is just in retrospection. But each sort of sequence has its own rise and fall, has its own sort of arc. And so it's like once John McClane realizes what's happening and how he's going to then solve it, then it begins a new sequence leading up to the climax where it's like, okay, here's how I'm going to outsmart them and ultimately beat the bad guy. And, it's a great script. So, the way he beats the bad guy, is a throwback to this little watch gag that was brought up earlier in the script. And then all the events after that, which can wrap up really quickly, you call resolution, denouement. Plot-wise, it's sort of just sweeping up, okay, what is now the fallout of the events of the story, and how does it apply to the characters? But the most important part of that resolution is how have the characters changed? How has the pre-existing condition improved? Die Hard would not be the classic it is if Bruce Willis and Bonnie Bedelia's characters weren't on the rocks, weren't estranged. And if they didn't kind of, come back together in the end, that adds the heart, that adds the theme, that adds the romance, which just make an awesome action movie, an even greater film.
And, but, it's interesting because by Die Hard 2, they're back on the rocks again. And I don't think we ever see her again.
Well, sequels are its own thing.
No, I know. But one of the things I think that that their resolution and the denouement is one place where sometimes films can get themselves into a lot of trouble. And you think about Die Hard, when you say they get back together, what does that entail? I mean, that entails them like under, an EMS blanket together or, riding off together, right? That's it. The film doesn't then go on to like show them happily like raising their kids. And some films do. And they like take it. They're like, we want you to know. And I think honestly, there is a desire that we have. We want to know, like, how are they okay? Do they make it? But it's always disappointing. Like I feel like I always like, I want to see John McClane and his wife. Do they like get back together and like the kids, they are in a loving family and all that stuff. But then, like, if they would have shown that, I would have been like, well, this is lame. I don't really.
Well, and then that would have been beyond the scope of the story. I mean, the story is like, when we say what's Die Hard about, it's about a cop trying to save a group of people from terrorists.
Yeah, but can you think of examples where people, they take that too far, where they like...
Usually in television, because television finales always usually wrap up with, now let's see what happened to these people over the next 20 years, because television as a different medium, each episode is telling a mini story within a larger story, and they're always about these characters. So when you have sort of a series finale, you can't just wrap up that episode or even this larger sort of arc that maybe the series was dealing with. You always inevitably then show where these people sort of ended up, how their marriages did, how their careers did. I mean, Silicon Valley, it had a great sort of twist on this whole gag when it sort of showed them all as old people reflecting on, the past series in retrospect, and it sort of made fun of that whole conceit. And it largely can be satisfying in television because as a series, we are sort of invested with these characters.
Yeah.
And, but in a film,
maybe I feel like when you start getting into coda territory, and maybe that's wrong of me.
And that's how I would define a coda. A coda would be, in some, certainly in superhero movies, a coda is sort of this post-credit sequence, which often will tease the next movie, but it also kind of can comment or extend the story beyond what we all kind of asked for. I mean, Jurassic Park famously kind of ends as soon as they escape from the island, they're sort of flying off in this helicopter, and it kind of just ends. I mean, it ends fairly quickly after the climax, and that resolution is basically, okay, they're safe, and this island, they've proven the idea that this was a bad mistake. You can't control nature. Nature finds a way. That's the theme of Jurassic Park. Don't try to play God to nature. It will always eat you. And they kind of escape it. And by escaping it and looking back on the island, flying away, it sort of reaffirms, we can't control it. And of course, every sequel is a great example of someone trying to control it and them always losing to nature. And so if they then landed home and we had a whole other scene that extended their characters, their journeys, that would be a coda. And unless it was really quick, it would make us all feel impatient because we've had this sense, this catharsis of our climax. And now, what we're talking about last week of it's usually right at the end, you realize, what it was about. And you realize, okay, this was about them, this ill-fated idea, this misguided attempt to control nature. Nature wins. They fly away. We're satisfied. And then we want the credits to roll. We want to move on because anything after that, you're like, wait, now what are you trying to teach me? What are you trying to show me? You've already taught me what this film taught me. Like in Sound of Metal, where the whole time we're thinking, what is it about? He goes back to his girlfriend. Is it about them getting back together, them playing music? Because for Ruben, he's chasing that. And then when you realize that's a dead end, the final scene, he's sitting there quiet. He takes out his implants, his ear implants, and just sort of sits in silence and has peace for the first time. You realize, this was about him finding peace. Any scene after that would then feel too long.
Yeah. There could have been a coda, there could have been anything else, and I feel like it would have ruined it. I mean, honestly, I was thinking about it later. As much as I loved everything about it, the one thing in retrospect, I was like, I wish they would have let the silence go longer before they kicked in the credit music. I don't know. But that's just such a nitpick thing. But I know you haven't finished reading Bell States yet, but what we're talking about right now was one of the things that I struggled with the most. Was where to end it. Because I feel like for me, like knowing where to start a story can be a challenge. Like where do you pick up, what's the word when you pick it up mid scene, right? Mid conversation, whatever. Like how do you start? That is a challenge. But like knowing when to end, like when to exit the story and just leave it, I feel like is an even bigger challenge because you have at that point, all of your work is on the line and it's like, it's yours to lose at that point. And so I can't really, with you, I've talked about kind of the two ways I was thinking about doing it. But I'm not going to tell you which way I went because I want to just get your reaction.
Yeah. And for me, structure has largely been something that's intuitive that I've felt that only is then going to become easy and something that is much more employable the more we do it, like over time and over experience. So therefore, learning some of these models and trying to apply them for younger writers can be helpful. The trap is, okay, I've got a story idea. Let me then read Save the Cat or Story or any other sort of, model on structure and then try to fit it into there. You can try that, but you've got to focus on the important things. Your character. Action plot is always guided by character. Your character is always defined by the world he or she is in and their pre-existing condition. So have a handle on that. What is the world of this story? And that goes by tone, by setting, by era. Is it very heightened world? Is it a very real world? Is it something where things would only happen as they actually would in real life? Or are we in a movie land where, cars can, get airborne going around a corner, like Speed? That opening shot of, it's just, when Keanu Reeves, they're coming, to this, they're police reporting to a scene and the car just goes over a hill completely airborne. That is the director saying, here's the world of this story. And then if you're like, all right, this is going to be awesome. And then of course you have pre-existing conditions, which Speed is interesting because it sort of sets up a pre-existing condition in its opening scene is sort of establishing this condition. These two cops go to, report to this crime of Dennis Hopper, who ends up getting away and injuring the Jeff Daniels character. And then they're sort of decorated for it. And then later, when that guy returns and puts a bomb on a bus, these characters, like a lot of movies would have started after the characters had already had the experience with the terrorist where they were wounded, he got away. That's the world of the story. That's a pre-existing condition. But Speed shows you, and because it's an awesome action movie, it's a great sequence, we just sort of go with it. But typically, they definitely added a sort of a whole extra sort of sequence to their opening act. And then once you have that, then you're like, okay, then how are those characters reacting to whatever this event is that starts the story? And that answers the question, like, why now? Like, what happens now? So we have the world, we have our characters, their pre-existing condition, and then what? Then why now? And then how do they get together? What is the journey they have to go on? And then from there, I mean, it's the characters hopefully can sort of tell you where to go. And for me, things started really clicking when I was watching other movies or reading other scripts and thinking about structure. Mm-hmm. I mean, the best thing for any writer, for me, was reading tons of scripts. It wasn't reading books about screenplays. It was reading screenplays. It was watching movies. And I had a great film and screenwriting teacher, Fred Stripe at Sarah Lawrence, and he would give us articles, he'd show us books, but he was just like, don't get too caught up in that. Read the scripts, watch the movies, consume the thing you're actually trying to make and think about these things. And so we would take a movie, when I was learning scene utility, basically every scene has to have a purpose. I took Unbreakable, I beat it out every single scene of that movie, and I sort of retroactively looked at, okay, what is the purpose of this scene, and wrote it out. And it was a really awesome sort of document where I was like, okay, here's this movie and how every scene has a purpose. So when I make my outlines, I beat out almost every scene ahead of time, and I have a sense of why that scene exists. And sometimes a scene can just exist to confirm a character trait or to sort of show the world, but you have to know that. And then if you have another scene that achieves the same thing, then maybe you have something you can cut. And of course, those scenes then are strung together in sequences and then acts and beats, and you kind of have a story. Yeah,
one thing that I will say where structure, I guess where I really ended up going to the Freytag's pyramid was when I started writing in earnest, and I really let the characters drive the story, and to the point that I didn't always know what was going to happen next. And I had an idea in my mind, and I hadn't outlined the story. I had an idea, and the story started arcing away from my idea. And it felt like it would have been disingenuous to sort of force it back onto those rails. But then I was like, I lost where is the story going? And now, it's almost like I'm shooting an arrow, but I've moved the direction that I'm shooting. And now I don't know how to get it to where it needs to land. And coming back and looking at the structure, that helped me figure out how to gently maneuver the story to a place, a landing place. And I think there are certainly places where that needs to be improved in its current iteration, but that is one way that structure I found to be helpful to me.
One of the greatest books that I've only read recently on drama, on story, is Poetics by Aristotle. This thousands-year-old text that Aaron Sorkin says there is a manual on writing, and it's Poetics by Aristotle, and it's paper thin. You could read it in a day.
It's also available for free online for the Gutenberg Project for anybody who's interested.
Or, I bought a $3 paperback from Amazon just so I could have it and keep it in my backpack and mark it up. But it was like so basic and foundational, it became revelatory. It was just sort of like, what is a beginning? What is an ending? And it was just sort of like his definitions. It just reminds you of just like, oh man, this is so simple. And like even the difference of like comedies and tragedies, where tragedies are about events, comedies are about people. You think about that, and obviously, he would define comedy and tragedy differently than we would today to a degree, but it just thinking about things in really foundational terms was so helpful to me as a writer. So for any writer out there of any medium, you've got to read Poetics by Aristotle. There's no excuse not to, because it is free, and it is not dense. It's not hard. It's not, doesn't feel like you're reading ancient text. It's very simple, very current, and it's so short. And it's another great sort of tool to add as, we're trying to gather these tools and the way to think about story and break story down. And he talks about it all: character, structure, plots, genre, tone. It's great.
Great. It's wonderful.
But even thinking of like The Assistant, which is essentially one day of this woman who's dealing with the office environment. All of the great structure models would apply.
You said that it doesn't have to be something big. It can be something subtle. And it makes me wonder, and I can't speak authoritatively as though I know all content, but the importance of matching that to the film. Because that Assistant is such a subtle film. If it had been a big sort of catalyst, I feel like it wouldn't have fit, right? And when you say that it's subtle, for anyone who hasn't seen it, it is subtle. Like, she comes in and she's just like sitting at a desk, and then the main character is like looking at her, not doing anything, and it's just like these weird, not weird in a bad way, but just these like awkward, like her super busy, like overloaded with work, and then like looking over, and then there's this pretty young girl like sort of flipping through a binder, clearly not reading it, just like doing something. And it's like that's the catalyst. But I feel like something that subtle would never work in Die Hard, right? Because Die Hard's a big film. It's got to be a big thing. And so I'm curious if that is a rule. And I would also be really interested to be able to find, again, exceptions where they sort of flip that. It's very subtle and there's something huge, or it's a big film and something very subtle changes everything.
And that's absolutely important things to know the film you're telling. I mean, that has to do with tone, but also the world. So when I say you're building the world of the film, part of that is you're communicating the world to the audience. This is going to be a subtle, very realistic, very contained film. So you set that up, and part of that is the type of film the director, and if the director and writer, they all have a handle on tone, they're all making the same movie, all of those things align. And then you can use something that, goes against that to your advantage. Cloverfield was sort of they're presenting a different kind of film, a different kind of world, a different kind of pre-existing conditions. And then with Cloverfield, all of a sudden it's an alien movie. And you're like, what? Or Dusk Till Dawn, an amazing example of this. Probably one of the best. It is a crime movie of George Clooney and Tarantino. These are brothers that, there's this whole opening act where they get away with this, or they barely escape from this, botched.
A bank robbery.
The bank robbery. They're going to the border and they just get a drink, and this hot, woman turns into a vampire, and you realize this is a vampire movie. And it's presented now in retrospect, it's a classic. Everybody knows it. But when it was presented, the earlier trailers did not spoil that fact. So it was presented in a way that was just as shocking to the characters who would have experienced it that way as to the audience. So that's a great, that's tonal shift, but also that's plot. So, you're not going to have this, a beautiful, pole dancer turning into a vampire in a bank robbery movie. But Dusk Till Dawn, they put them together. And then it becomes, and then your plot, you're like, oh, this isn't about these bank robbers going across the border. It's about these guys in a whole new movie having to survive. And it's just brilliant because Tarantino, who wrote it, produced it, Robert Rodriguez directed it. These two filmmakers have such a handle on tone and story. So they are the ones who can really effectively mash up tone and plot and structure and do all that. Of course, Tarantino messed with structure famously in Pulp Fiction, which had a very linear structure. And then the edit just pulled it all out of order and created something, greater than if that film could have been experienced traditionally. Because in a way, John Travolta's character dies halfway through that story, and then it ends with Bruce Willis, and because of the way he then re-edits it and presents it to you, the final moment is John Travolta and Sam Jackson triumphantly walking out of the diner, and then the credits roll. You're like, yeah, only to know that Travolta's about to be shot very dispassionately in the following days of the end of that story. So yes, absolutely. Those things only work. It only works to intentionally mess with those things if you kind of have a greater idea. I mean, I tried doing this in Fair. It was a very conscious idea to set up one kind of movie and then shift it to a different kind of movie entirely. And that was an experimental, intentional shift that I was just really interested in playing with. And it worked because it played with expectations. I mean, it worked for most people, certainly didn't work for a lot of people. And that's the risk of kind of structural or genre changes.
Yeah.
Good question, man. Enjoyed chatting about it.
Well, thanks. I think we obviously haven't answered.
We solved it.
Yeah, we haven't solved the problem of structure, but it's been informative for me, and hopefully it sort of just opened up some new questions. That's always the goal, right? Don't answer. Let's leave people with more questions than we answered.
Before we go, we've got 2 picks to give.
2 picks and no shits.
Ooh, trademark that right now. Recommendations. Last week we touched on briefly. Do you have something to recommend to our audience?
Yeah, you want me to go first?
No, I'm going to go first because yours is going to be better. I can feel it. I'm going to recommend The Mighty Ducks. Classic movie.
You know what? My son just started rollerblading like yesterday, and I'm like, I need to make him watch The Mighty Ducks because that will make this stick. If I can get him to watch that film.
So not only does The Mighty Ducks hold up, we rewatched it recently. My kids loved it. That movie has spawned 2 sequels, which are lesser, but they're watchable, an animated series. But now, and the reason that I'm recommending it, is that it spawned The Mighty Ducks Game Changers, a brand new series, live action on Disney Plus, continuing the story. Emilio Estevez is a supporting character, and Lauren Graham is kind of the lead, and the Ducks have kind of mutated into this elitist team that is too obsessed with winning. So they're kind of the villains in this new series. And we watched it. It is so funny, so smart. We all love it. All 5 of us. Like Friday night is like, oh, the new Ducks episode is coming out. It is just a great, smart series. It's like, it's just strong. You know, all the cast is great. The dialogue's great. Lauren Graham is just, I think she's just such a strong, I just love her. It's just a comedic actress. I didn't love Gilmore Girls, but it wasn't because of her. It was really because of the writing. But, you know, Parenthood, she's incredible in, and she's been in some great movies. But she really is just sweet and charming, and Emilio Estevez is fun. And it's a great, if you like The Mighty Ducks, check out Mighty Ducks Game Changers on Disney Plus.
That's interesting. I wonder if this sort of like reversal of old classics is going to become more common, because are you familiar with Cobra Kai?
Oh yeah.
And that is such an interesting idea to me, like the flip, you know, just how their lives turned out, but then also because of that, they ended up sort of changing places in like villainy, you know, to a certain extent. That's kind of oversimplifying it, but
and the amazing thing is now, because the advent of streaming platforms and all these old nostalgic movies coming in, these companies, they have all this data of like, oh, what are people watching? So they're like, let's make a series on that property, because we already know people are watching it now. So they, you know, Karate Kid's been streamed, and Mighty Ducks is being streamed, and like Sister Act was just a huge hit on Disney Plus, just because it's a great movie and people are rewatching it. So now there's a Sister Act series in the work that, and it's just a genius sort of model of like, okay, what nostalgic movies are people watching, and now how can we turn a series into them?
How can we cash
but the
in?
great thing about Cobra Kai and Mighty Ducks is they're not just doing cash grabs with just bottom of the barrel writing and you know, filmmaking. They're getting great talent to write and direct and produce and act in these things. So they're just a lot of fun.
well, yeah, I mean, your rec might win this week. Mine is T.
T for Thomas, the letter T. Boom. Thank you for listening, everybody. We're done.
Letter of the day. All right, take it. No. Tea the drink. I feel like, you know, tea, it always kind of comes second. And I'm not talking about sweet tea. I'm talking about
White
tea. And not Texas tea neither. Coffee, I feel like, really reigns supreme. And in recent years, I just have not been able to drink coffee. It just destroys my stomach.
Oh, wow.
I hate it. You know, like ulcers, all that kind of stuff. And
Really?
so I stopped drinking it, but I still like caffeine. And then I discovered tea, and there's a lot of nuance to coffee, and I still like the flavor of coffee. But tea is so dynamic. I mean, you know, everybody knows like, oh, English breakfast. I'll have an English breakfast. But then like there's Earl Grey with the bergamot, right? There's Assam, which I really love. There's like a first flush Darjeeling. And you know, you make these teas, you don't
Mint,
need any
chamomile.
sweetener. Yeah, anything you want.
Green.
You know, black teas, white teas, green teas. Gengen's wife, she brought me this really great tin of green tea from China.
Gengen
and
being
it's fantastic.
Justin's Chinese cousin.
Yeah, Gengen is my cousin. What up, Gengen?
What up, son?
Yeah, he probably does listen, because we do have a listener in China. So Gengen, if you're listening, we love you. You did a great job in Fair. Can't wait to see you.
He's been doing more acting. You know, he and I keep up.
I know, he's great. I love Gengen. Anyway, his wife brought me a tin when she was in town like a year or two ago, and great, delicious, authentic Chinese green tea. So anyway, that's my recommendation. And loose leaf, and you know, you can go on Amazon and get these great buys of like really top shelf tea for less than you would pay for like a box of, you know, whatever you buy at the grocery store. So check it out. It's worth it. It's also, you know what I really like about it? I also like the ritual of it. You boil the water, you sit down, you pour your tea, you wait 5 minutes, you pour it, you enjoy it. It's wonderful. So that's my rec.
It's a great rec. I am a coffee drinker, but we are definitely a tea house. My wife does not drink coffee. She loves tea. She's got a great tea drawer with a great collection. And she has instituted tea time in our house. She homeschools the boys, and I don't know if they do it daily, but they definitely do it at least once a week, where they'll have a nice tea time, and the boys will drink tea. You know, it's milked up. But Skylar sometimes has tea. I just appreciate that Amanda loves and appreciates tea because my kids are appreciating it too. They actually like coffee. So my kids right now, as children, are coffee drinkers and tea drinkers. But I love by proxy tea, and every now and then I will have a glass of hot tea and enjoy it because I grew up in a tea house. My parents drank tea and not coffee. But great recommendation.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Thomas, do you want to tell our listeners about the Sun Valley Film Festival Producers Grant?
Drum roll, please. We didn't win. Hey, but it was an honor just to be nominated. Seriously, thank you to the Sun Valley Film Festival for making us a finalist and getting our film out there.
For all your thoughts and prayers.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Help us grow our audience by, you know what, don't help us. Don't subscribe, don't review, don't do anything that would take any time out of your day because you've got stuff to do.
Amanda, mom of 3, says, nice pace, interesting, love the bromance, create or die, looking forward to what's next. Wonder who that is.
I don't know, man, but she sounds beautiful. Jojo said, enjoyable. Listen to episode 4. I was enthralled hearing about both of their fields of work. They both asked each other good questions, too. Also, I second Justin's rec. I've been reading Le Guin myself. Thomas's rec was completely unexpected. Speaking of tone management, ooh, nice little callback to the episode.
What was your tone on that day?
Well, we were talking about tone, and then my rec was the coffee, the Panera coffee. And he was like, whoa, talk about tone management. All right, twofriendswithapodcast.com is our website. It's got our email address, hey@twofriendswithapodcast.com. Send us your thoughts and prayers, or follow us on Instagram @twofriendspod. Justin, if people want to follow us at our company, where can they go?
Theologypictures.com, or follow us on Instagram @theology.
Nobody needs to follow me, but if you want to, you can find me at thomasstory.com with links to my socials with some films. And Letterboxd. I'm on Letterboxd. I'm tracking all the films I watch. So if you're a Letterboxd person, find me there.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
We love you.
We do love you. Coming up, Justin talks about some dude's pyramid scheme and how it applies to story structure.
At least I don't get all pretentious and invoke Aristotle's Poetics.
Say that again and speak the words clearly.
At least I don't act like a douchebag and bring up Aristotle's Poetics. At least I don't get all pretentious and invoke Aristotle's Poetics and then make Justin re-say the line a bunch of times because I'm pretentious.
Because you speak English good. Stay with us.
At least. All right. At least I don't.
You got it.
You write all of the most marbly mouth things for me, though. You're like, here, take all these marbles in your mouth.
It's my fault.
And then you say them. And
yeah, at least I don't get marbly.
You say that line.
At least I don't get all pretentious and invoke Aristotle's Poetics.
See, I don't even. What did you even say?
I shot a kid.